Before starting on my career, I think it would be interesting to recall that All India Radio completed 80 years last year, 2016. Established in 1930 under the British Imperial government, it went through a lot of partner changes till it was deemed the All India Radio on the 8th of June 1936. One can imagine what a tremendously significant period of our history it saw through, and also the very important role it took in the development of political events of that time. Today it stands to be the world's largest radio broadcasting organization, and I feel proud to have been a part, however minuscule, of that organization. I joined All India Radio in 1985 and was there till 2000. Before joining, actually, I hardly knew anything about All India Radio or its functioning, or for that matter, newsreading. However, I had always been very interested in reading things out aloud from my childhood. I was fascinated by all those wonderful, lovely voices coming out of the radio set, and used to wonder what exactly went on behind the screen, so to say, and wishing I were a part of it. My early life, I was more or less taken up with family duties and responsibilities, and it was only when I was well into my 40s that I thought I had a little time to pursue my dreams. I wrote a letter addressed to whoever it may concern. I didn't know who to address to exactly. And All India Radio, Parliament Street, New Delhi, applying for a job as a newsreader, English newsreader. 3 months went by, and I had already given up all hopes of hearing from them when there suddenly arrived a letter, a yellow envelope with my name and Government of India stamped on it, asking me to come for an audition. Greatly excited, but without much hope, I presented myself at the scheduled time, scheduled date, and among 70 applicants, when 5 were selected and my name was one of them, I came back home in a daze. That was the first time I crossed the gates of All India Radio, Parliament Street. The next time was when we had to go for an interview. Nowadays, I believe one has to sit for a 3-hour written exam, but at our time, there was nothing like that. Just the audition and the interview, all that were required. I got through the interview and was taken in as a casual newsreader because, as I've said, I was already past 40 and didn't qualify for a regular government job. So now I was a part of All India Radio. But before we were allowed to start broadcasting, we had to go through a short period of training. Anyway, we went through that, and one fine day, there I was, entering the studio, sitting before the mic, and uttering those words that I had heard so many times before. This is All India Radio, the news read by so-and-so. Slightly wavering voice. I'd thought nothing of these words earlier when I heard them, but now, with a great sense of awe, I said that this is All India Radio, the news read by so-and-so, particularly thinking of all those millions of people who might be listening to my voice. It was very exciting, it was daunting, but a little bit of that excitement, I think, stayed on with me all along, contributing to a great deal to my pleasure in the job of a newsreader. Even now, when I hear these words, this is All India Radio giving you the news, I feel a thrill within me. It was indeed a very great pleasure and privilege to have known such legendary newscasters such as Mr. Sushil Sen, Mrs. Lotika Ratnam, Mr. Varun Haldar, and of course Mr. Sushil Jhaveri, who was the chief newsreader at that time. With their vast experiences in the field of broadcasting and the anecdotes they came out with from time to time, they were really very interesting company. Also, one could learn so much just by talking to them about diction, about vocabulary, about delivery, all this. When I joined, Mr. Jhaveri was the chief newsreader, but within a few years he retired and Mr. Varun Haldar came in. With his rich, mellow voice, apart from doing various other programs, lending his voice to documentaries, etc., he was also the anchor of a very popular Western music program, light music, lunchtime music. And people of my generation still remember him as with great admiration and nostalgia. Now, talking about Mr. Sushil Sen, he joined, I believe, somewhere in the 40s. And in his long career, he worked as a newscaster, a roving journalist, as well as a sports commentator. One of his greatest moments, I think, was when he was the first person to report the liberation of East Pakistan. He was the first person to report at that same, sitting at the same table, the handing over of power by General Niazi of Pakistan to General J.S. Arora of India. Of course, who can forget his tremendous, inimitable baritone? Definitely he can be said to be the role model of a whole generation of newscasters. It was a short session, I think, as far as I remember, consisting of 10 sittings with him in his room in the All India Radio building. There were stacks of old news bulletins of AIR, of course, kept in his room, and each of us, the newcomers that is, was asked to read one of these bulletins, to practice reading, with him guiding and correcting us whenever necessary. The most important thing in news reading was, of course, the voice, the quality of the voice. Because on TV, a lot of the attention is taken away by the visuals. But here one can't see the newsreader. There's no scope of lip reading or body language, observing body language. So everything depended on the quality of the voice, the way of presentation. And of course, the next thing was diction, how you enunciate your words, the delivery and presentation. While we practiced reading, Mr. Jhaveri would tell us various other things also, apart from correcting our pronunciation whenever necessary. He told us the correct syllable in a word that had to be stressed upon, the words in a sentence that had to be emphasized, the speed which would be the correct to read the news, neither too fast nor too slow, where to pause. Also, how to control our breathing, particularly when reading long sentences, so that the sound of our breathing doesn't come onto the microphone. Talking about pronunciation, I would like to mention a book of pronunciation by Daniel Jones, which we always found on the table of the newsreaders. And whenever we were a little uncertain of the pronunciation of any word, we could quickly look it up before going into the studio, feeling much more confident. I remember that the TV newsreaders from the next building also came over quite often to consult this all-important book. During the time I was there, several of our newsreaders actually went over to TV News to become very famous TV newsreaders. For example, Rini Khanna, Sukanya Balakrishnan, Vijay Kumar, several others. Well, diction is actually a general term, meaning your style, your speaking, your style of using the words when you're speaking or reading or even singing, and in whatever language it may be. Good diction would imply an ability to express yourself very clearly. The clarity is very important, and in a very effective way, bringing to the listener exactly what you're trying to convey. The voice is, of course, the basic requirement, particularly on a news broadcast, as I told you earlier also. But diction definitely is the most important thing, because together they help you to bring out the exact meaning of what you're trying to express. Diction would mean, of course, but the diction would be applicable to any language or whatsoever. When you're trying to talk about colonial hangover, it would obviously be in the context of English news reading only. Now, when the English education came into our country, and more people were learning English, using it, naturally the tendency would be to emulate the people from whom they learnt it, whose mother tongue it was. So that came to be the accepted style of speaking in those times. Later, of course, they did change quite a bit, but at that time, even naturally, newsreaders had to adopt that style. And in a newsreader, that was the best accepted style at that time. But rather than calling it a colonial hangover, I would say that it was the influence of the people who brought it to our country, whatever the circumstances, who taught it to us to begin with. And nowadays they are changing, the style is changing because that influence is waning, naturally. Nowadays one hears some youngsters speaking with a marked American accent. I would say that is the result of the influence they are under, either teachers or some sort of environment, whether they were there or the environment within which they live. Well, during those 15 years, I cannot really recall any major changes, except that, as I said just now, the style was changing, gradually but surely, and a more Indianized, a more casual style was coming in. But of course, very importantly, keeping the clarity uncompromised. Whatever the style, it had to be clear, it had to be effective in giving out the basic idea of what you are trying to convey. Well, since its inception, All India Radio, right through the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s, was the undisputed king of media. It was the only source of information, the only means of connectivity, connecting the millions of the country. In the rural areas, where there was a lot of illiteracy, the newspapers, even when available, were not of much use because of the illiteracy. So it was the radio that brought to them information, that brought education, and that brought a lot of entertainment also. People in villages could be easily seen gathering at roadside tea shops where there were wireless sets and enjoying various programs, news bulletins that were broadcast by the All India Radio. News bulletins were heard all over the country, everywhere. Very interesting music programs were broadcast by the All India Radio, both light and classical music of a very high standard. Several talks, discussions were heard. Football and cricket commentaries were very, very popular, even in the villages. And people were very fond of listening to the radio, really. There were some special programs provided by All India Radio also. I would like to mention the weather forecasts for very remote areas. For example, high altitudes and even in ships on the high seas. To them, weather forecasts were very important to be able to plan their trip, the coming moves. This was done through a collaboration between Meteorological Department and All India Radio through a special frequency. I remember a cousin in the Air Force who was leading a big group of officers on a trek on a very high altitude in the Himalayas, and also a friend on her way to the Antarcticas in a ship for science research work, telling me later that they had heard my voice reading their weather forecast. It was a good feeling for them to hear a familiar voice, and for me it was a great feeling. Now, if I may, I would like to recall a very unique memory of the very early 40s. Well, it was during the Second World War. I was very small, but I still remember very distinctly. I was very small, and my uncle, my father's younger brother, was in London for further studies, and the entire family remained in a state of constant tension because the Blitzkrieg that was in full swing in London at that time. Every evening, not every evening, on Saturday evenings, there was a special program in which the Indians in London could reach out with their voices to their families in India and give them messages, reassure them of their welfare, introducing themselves one by one. As I said, I was very small, but I really do remember very distinctly the scene. Family members gathered in front of the wireless set with anxious faces and waiting with bated breaths for that beloved voice. And when the voice did come, you can imagine the joy and the assurance that it brought out of that little wireless set for the family members. Now, TV came in the 60s, immediately attracting people with its audiovisual aspect. But radio remained very important because TV was not very common at that time. And also in the rural areas, it took a very long time to reach. Well, several years, actually. Even in the 80s and 90s, when TV was growing very fast and posing an enormous challenge to radio, the latter still was important, a very effective or a very significant part of life, particularly for the elderly. But those were the days when internet was coming in, the information age was coming in, bringing instant access to the very latest news and affecting radio's role as information disseminator. Newer changes came along, technology advanced at a tremendous pace. We have all seen that, and I'm sure new challenges and new surprises are still waiting for us through technology. But radio still retains its relevance, its position in the country, and to some extent the world also. Particularly in the rural areas, they are still widely used. There are still important news, special news for farmers, special news for teachers. And radio remains important, adapting itself to these new changes that are coming in. Well, I have very pleasant memories of All India Radio. Mostly of the newsroom, which was the center of activities of newsreaders, as well as the most important place for us, the studio, from where news was actually broadcast. The GNR, or the General Newsroom, a huge hall, had the chief editor's table at one end and the newsreader's table at the other end. And in between were scattered various tables where the different editors sat editing their respective bulletins. Bulletins went on the air almost every hour since Mr. Rajiv Gandhi's prime ministership, as far as I remember. Editors, newsreaders kept coming in and out, and everything was very hectic all the time. There were 3 major bulletins during the day: 8:10 in the morning, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and 9 o'clock at night. It was during one of these major bulletins that I faced one of my most awkward and embarrassing situations ever. I think it was one of the 8:10 bulletins. I probably had had a cold, and right in the middle of the bulletin, my voice broke. I just lost it and kept croaking, literally croaking. No matter what I did, I couldn't get it back to the normal. Utterly in despair and feeling utterly hopeless and helpless and terribly upset, I managed to limp through the bulletin, still croaking. And when I finished, I came out of the studio to find, to my acute embarrassment, the director standing right outside the door with as anxious a face and so much of anxiety. He said, "Mrs. Sen, what happened? I thought you must have had some bad news just before entering the studio and you were crying." What could I do? The fallout was that I was taken off all major bulletins for 3 months. These were all physical human failings. They were accepted as such. But you see, rules are rules, and if one spoils a major bulletin, one has to face some consequences. The GNR remained a very busy place even at night, because even nightly bulletins kept going on the air. There were the parliament commentaries. There were also the overseas bulletins, which were broadcast mostly at night. And there were readers of foreign language bulletins also that kept wandering into the newsroom, because the rest of the building was dark and silent. It was only the GNR. And of course, probably the Hindi GNR also, that kept busy during those times. Night shifts were very long, probably from, I think, 11 o'clock at night till 5 o'clock in the morning. And I remember towards the early morning bulletins, the 3 o'clock and the 4 o'clock ones, I remember the lines of the text waving in front of my eyes, and I couldn't focus on the words correctly sometimes. It was rather a trying shift, the night shift. But with all those newsreaders gathered round the table and flasks of tea and coffee, and particularly during the night, during the winter months, trying to keep ourselves warm and awake, I have very pleasant memories of the night shifts also. I think of them with great nostalgia. Now, there was one story going round in the newsroom at that time, that one of the newsreaders had misplaced his pen just before going into the studio, Rather upset, he went in when he had to, completed the bulletin, and instead of saying, "And that is the end of the news," he solemnly declared, "And that is the end of the pen." I, for one, can believe it, because with sleep in his eyes and the pen on his mind, what else could